And so the course is Isaiah for Beginners, and the subtitle, The Life and Times of Isaiah. And just to give you an idea of how we're going to do this book, this is not going to be a line-by-line type study. It would take 2 quarters, even 3 quarters to do all of that. I'm going to take some time in explaining how the book was written. That's the most important thing to understand if you're going to understand the book of Isaiah. And then I'm going to select some key passages in Isaiah that demonstrate his prophetic utterances, passages that perhaps we're familiar with, but we'll be able to see in context once you understand how this book was written. I just want to take an informal survey here. How many people have actually read the book of Isaiah all the way through? Okay, that's a good number. To say that the book of Isaiah is difficult to understand is an understatement. I mean, you read the book and you kind of understand the individual words he's using, but you can never quite grasp the whole of what he's talking about. At times, you're not sure if Isaiah is repeating himself, or he's talking about someone else, or he's talking about himself. You're never quite sure where you are as you read through his book, or perhaps he's introduced something new. You're always off balance. At times you feel that you're on solid ground as he recounts some historical events with real people in real time, but then without warning, he goes off and relates a vision given to him by God. Now many times the literary devices that are used to help the reader discern the meaning actually confuse the reader if he's not familiar with Hebrew poetry and Isaiah's style of writing. So this series is going to try to simplify and clarify Isaiah's prophetic message for those who are reading him obviously in modern times. So we begin with a brief introduction of Isaiah himself and follow with how this book was written, which is, in my own studies, which I found fascinating. Just how the book was put together is really fascinating. So Isaiah refers to events and times before his ministry, and he also talks about things that are in the future beyond his own lifetime. So he talks about the past, he talks about the present, he talks about the near future, he talks about the future way far in advance. So let's review a brief timeline of Jewish history and the various books and authors who recorded Jewish history. And I think if we do this first, it'll help us to identify some of the major events that Isaiah is going to be talking about, as well as pinpoint where exactly does Isaiah fit in the history of the Jewish people. So let's take a look at this Old Testament survey. If you picked up some sheets in the back, and if you didn't and want to, don't be shy, get up and go back there. There's a lectern. And there are 2. There's your lesson notes just to follow along, and then there's this extra sheet that I've added, which is the Old Testament survey. It's a great resource. You can keep it, fold it in your Bible. You'll be able to go back and refer to it in the future whenever someone is talking about the old period. So you'll notice at the top of the survey there's the period, meaning the period of time, and then the time in years, and then the major events and characters, and then there's the heading books. In other words, the books of the Bible that talk about those particular things. So briefly, we begin with what's called the antediluvian period. Antediluvian, diluvian referring to the flood. Ante meaning before the flood. So the period before the flood, that period of time, 5,000 plus BC. Major events and characters, well, the creation and the fall of man, the promise of redemption, the increasing of sin in the world, Noah and the flood. All of those events are written about in Genesis chapter 1 to 8. So you could say the antediluvian period is written about in Genesis chapters 1 to 8. Next period is post-diluvian period, after the flood, 3000 BC roughly. And here you find the genealogies of man, the spreading of idolatry, the Tower of Babel, and Genesis chapters 9 to 11 talk about these and other events of that period. The third period mentioned is the Patriarchy, around 2000 BC. And here you, in the Bible, you read about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the 12 tribes and how they were formed. And Genesis chapters 12 all the way to chapter 50 talk about these events. And also the book of Job not only was written, but is situated in that time period. Then you have the period of bondage, fourth period, 1600 BC, 400 years in captivity, the people of God, the Israelites, 400 years in Egypt, Moses, the Passover, the Exodus from Egypt, and you have Exodus chapter 1 to 12 talk about that. Fifth period is the period of conquest, 1400 BC. This will talk about the 40 years in the desert, the arrival of God's people into the promised land, the judges who govern, if you wish, at that time, and the 12 tribes, and also Samuel is introduced during this period. And we have several books now that talk about these events. Exodus 13 to 40, the book of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel chapters 1 to 10. All of these books talk about these particular things. So sometimes, if you're wanting to study a particular events in the Bible, this survey here will help you at least pinpoint which books talk about which events. Then we have the United Kingdom around 1000 BC, and here the tribes are then ruled by one king. And so you have the stories of Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. And again, many books talk about this period of the United Kingdom. 1 Samuel 11 to 31, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings 1 to 11, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, 1 to 9, the book of Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes. All those books are talking about the period of the United Kingdom. Then we have the period of the divided kingdom. There was civil war after the death of Solomon, and so the united country broke into two. The northern kingdom, 10 tribes, the southern kingdom, 2 tribes, 800 BC. And here you have the establishment of the north and southern kingdoms. You have the apostasy, the great apostasy, people going away from God and going into pagan Baal worship. You have the destruction of the northern kingdom and the emergence of the prophets. And this is where Isaiah is. This is where we can pinpoint Isaiah's ministry. He's during the time of the divided kingdom. There are other books that talk about this time. 1 Kings chapter 12 to 22, 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles 10 to 36. As I mentioned, the prophet Isaiah, but also the prophet Hosea, Micah, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Jeremiah, and Zephaniah. All of these prophets are talking about this particular period in Jewish history. So we'll be studying Isaiah. Now you know when Isaiah preached and what was going on during his time. Then the 7th period is the period of exile, 600 BC. Here we read about the destruction of Jerusalem, 70 years in captivity in Babylon, and those who write about this period, Jeremiah and Daniel, Ezekiel, and of course Lamentations. Next period is the period of restoration around 500 BC. And here we talk about the return of the remnant from Babylonian captivity and also the end of idolatry. The Jewish people never again go back into idolatry after this period. And you have the writers Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, who write about this period in Jewish history. And then there's what's called the period of silence, 400 BC all the way to Jesus, well, to John the Baptist anyways. No prophets, no inspired writings during that time. This is called, among other things, the intertestamentary period. During this time there were books that were produced. They weren't inspired books, but they were books that wrote about and described what was going on during this period of time. We call them the apocryphal books, meaning the hidden books or the hidden writings. And for example, you have the book of Esdras or the book of Judith or the book of Maccabees. These particular books talk about that period of time, 400 BC to the time of Jesus. All right, so that gives you a little, just a quick survey of this period and the time when Isaiah was functioning as a prophet of the Lord during the period of the divided kingdom. So let's talk a little bit about Isaiah himself. Isaiah, it says he was the son of Amoz. And Amoz is mentioned several times in connection to Isaiah, but we don't have any other information about him, only that he was the father of Isaiah. Isaiah is considered one of the major prophets, along with Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel. A major prophet because of the length of his book. Not that he was more important than another prophet, simply because their books, not only him, but Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, they had books that were longer than the other prophets. Also, his book appears first among these other prophets, a position of honor, since Isaiah is sometimes referred to as the prince of prophets. And if you read his book and compare it to some of the other books, you'll know why they gave him this title. Now, Isaiah's name means the Lord saves. The Lord saves. And as we noted in our Old Testament timeline, Isaiah lived and prophesied during the time of other Jewish prophets. Amos and Hosea and Micah also prophesied during the time of Isaiah. We also know that his ministry began in 740 BC because he himself mentions in Isaiah chapter 6 verse 1 that his visions began the year that King Uzziah died. And the death of King Uzziah is recorded in history. And so that's how we know when Isaiah's prophecy and prophetic work began, 740 BC. We also know that he was married, and in his own writings he refers to his wife not by her given family name, but rather by the term the prophetess. He called her the prophetess in chapter 8 verse 3. And he may have done this because she was the wife of a prophet or because she herself was used by God in this way. But we have no record, no official record of any prophecies that she made. Now Isaiah has two sons that were given names that signified prophetic statements made by their father. In other words, Isaiah made a prophetic statement, and in order to kind of really double down on it, he named his children, he named his sons according to the prophetic statements that he had made. Let's get their names, there you go. One of them was Shir-Jashub, which means the remnant return. The remnant return. And this was a prophetic reference of the literal and spiritual return of Judah after their destruction and their exile to Babylon for 70 years. He names his son according to what will happen to the Jews. And then he has another son, and his name is Mar-Shalal-Hashbaz. Mar-Shalal-Hashbaz, which means 4 different words: haste, spoil, speed, and pray. Now this name implied the eventual attack of the Assyrians on the northern kingdom of Israel and its neighbor Syria. And so Assyria, those who were doing the attacking, was anxious to attack, ready to destroy and pillage all of its enemies. And so the boy's name referred to the character of the enemies that would come in and attack the Israelites. Haste, they came as a swift army. Spoil, they came to take the spoil. Speed, they were lightning quick in their attack. It didn't take them long to overcome the enemy. And prey, Israel would be the prey. And so the name refers to events that were going to take place in Israel. It's also interesting to note that the Bible mentions the details of the marriages of several of the prophets. And I thought it might be interesting when we speak about these men to know something about their personal lives. Jeremiah, for example, was celibate. We find that out in Jeremiah 16:2. He never married. Hosea, his wife, was unfaithful. And we find that out from the beginning. He's told to take a wife who's going to be unfaithful to him. Ezekiel's wife died suddenly, but he was not allowed to mourn over her. Very unusual. We read about that in Ezekiel 24:16-18. And we find out that Isaiah's wife collaborated with him in naming their sons with names that reflected prophecy concerning Israel and Judah. Now, Isaiah probably spent most of his life in Jerusalem. And judging by the quality of his writing and his access to the royal court of successive kings, he had access. And in those days, you just didn't walk into the palace to see the king. If you write about what's going on into the royal court, it means that you have some sort of position. And so Isaiah talks about what's going on at the royal court, meaning he had some sort of high position. He was involved with Uzziah, of course, Jotham, Ahaz, the king Ahaz, and then the king Hezekiah. And scholars believe that he was a well-educated, wealthy aristocrat, or perhaps he was part of a priestly family, and this is what gave him access to the royal court. Even though it seems that Isaiah had a high position in the society of his time, he was very much aware of the plight of the poor, the excesses of the rich, and the injustices that were visited on the common man by those who were in power, as well as the immorality and the unfaithfulness that existed at every level of society, both rich and poor. And so despite the advantages of education, advantages of education and wealth, we're talking about Isaiah now, and the access that he had to the royal court as God's prophet, he was very much like the more common prophets of the day, who were social justice prophets, who were his contemporary, Amos and Hosea and Micah. They spoke out against injustice. Their prophecies were not just about what's going to happen in the future, or some prophecy that would take place in the near future. Many times these prophets spoke up against the injustices that were taking place in their society, the immorality that was taking place in that society, and of course also the false worship that was taking place in that society, not just in the future, but right then and there. And despite all of his wealth and position, Isaiah was very much like these social justice prophets. Not only did he speak truth to power, he did so with a very beautiful and complex and majestic style of writing, which we will investigate as the lessons go on. And so this bold and fearless pronouncement of God's word is what probably led to his death at the hands of Manasseh, who Jewish tradition says had Isaiah executed by having him sawn in two. And we read about this in Hebrews 11:37, where the Hebrew writer is talking about the heroes of faith, and he talks about all the things that the heroes of faith suffered. And he says in verse 37, he says, they were stoned, they were sawn in two. That bit right there, they were sawn in two, is a reference back to Isaiah and the way that he was martyred at the hands of Manasseh. As far as the times, what are the times? What was it like when Isaiah, politically and religiously, what was going on in those times? Little map here to help us understand some of the geopolitical pressures that were taking place. Isaiah wrote during the stormy period marking the expansion of the Assyrian Empire and the decline of Israel. We know that Israel reached its peak of wealth and influence and power during the reign of Solomon, who built on the foundation of David. And so the temple was built during his time. The country was united, fabulously wealthy and respected and at peace with its neighbors. That was a high point. But after Solomon died and the civil war started and there was a breakup between north and south, then there began a decline. Well, while the decline was taking place in Israel, north and south, the north was referred to as Israel, the south of the country was referred as Judah. Well, to the very far north there was the country of Assyria, and that country was expanding its power. It had a great army. It was becoming the world power during its time. And so under the king Tiglath-Pileser III, he reigned 745 to 727 BC. The Assyrians swept westward into Aram. We see Aram here. This is also called Syria. He swept towards Aram and then into Canaan, where the northern kingdom of Israel was located. So they swept downwards into Israel. In response, the kings of Aram and the king of Israel tried to pressure Ahaz of Judah, of the southern kingdom, into joining an alliance against against Assyria. So you see the picture? You've got Aram and Israel, a joint defense pact, and they're trying to talk Judah to join them. So the three of them would be united together against the attack of Assyria. Well, instead of joining this alliance, Ahaz, the king of Judah at the time, chose to ask Tiglath-Pileser, that's this guy up in Assyria, to ask the king of Assyria for help against Israel and Aram. Now today, the political term for that is double-cross. He double-crossed the king of Aram and the king of Israel, who were trying to get him to join their alliance by jumping over them and making an alliance with Assyria to protect Judah against Aram and Israel. So instead of joining the alliance, he made a deal with Assyria. And so what's important about this arrangement is that Isaiah condemned this decision. Isaiah, who lived during this time, who was preaching during this time, condemned this treachery and warned the king against making an alliance with Assyria. Well, Assyria did help Judah by conquering and deporting the northern kingdom. But this left the southern kingdom even more vulnerable and exposed to attack from the north. Now Israel could not be a buffer country or state to protect them from attack. It had been destroyed and all the people had been scattered. And so now Judah, their northern flank is unprotected. And so the godly king Hezekiah prayed earnestly, and Isaiah prophesied that God would force the Assyrians to withdraw, and we find out in Isaiah chapter 37 that they do withdraw from their attack on Judah. Nevertheless, Isaiah warned that because of her sins, Judah would be defeated and brought into captivity, not by the Assyrians, but by the Babylonians. This was the nation that eventually defeated the Assyrians and took over as the world power at the time. And so the Assyrians did not overtake Judah, but the Babylonians did. Now, although the fall of Jerusalem would not take place until 586 BC, Isaiah's prophecy 100 years before then said the following, that Judah would be destroyed, that there would be a captivity of the people and they would be brought to a foreign land, and then eventually they would be restored back from their captivity to their home nation. And he made this prophecy 100 years before these events actually took place. Isaiah also predicts the rise of Cyrus, who would unite the Medes and the Persians to create the Medo-Persian Empire, if you wish. And under Cyrus would conquer the Babylonians. And so Isaiah even spoke about this particular event way before it takes place. We find out in history the decree of Cyrus would be the thing that eventually would allow the Jews to return home in order to rebuild their city and their wall and their temple. That took place in 537 BC. And so in his prophecy, Isaiah claimed that this deliverance would prefigure another deliverance from sin, which would take place even further in the future. So you see what I'm talking about when I talk about, he speaks truth to power. Hang on. He speaks truth to power in the present time. He tells the king right now, don't do what you're about to do, it won't work, and sure enough it doesn't. He then makes a prophecy for the future, that in the future, 100 years, that's the near future. In the future, a nation would come in and destroy Judah, would carry them off into captivity, but eventually they would return. That's a prophecy in the near future. And then he also makes prophecies in the far future when he talks about, but one day someone will come and deliver God's people from their sin. And of course there, he's talking about the Messiah. And our problem when we read the book of Isaiah is that sometimes we're not sure, is he talking about right now? Is he talking about the near future, or is he talking about the far future? And so I think the preparation lessons that I've got for you for the next couple of weeks will help all of us understand his form of writing. So Isaiah's many visions and prophecies again spoke of the present, the near future, and the distant future. All right, I want to finish my class this morning with a video. Yeah, just enough time for that. And for all of you who are concerned about copyrights and stuff, we have permission to show this video to a live audience, which we will do. And those of you who are maybe watching this class in the future, make a little prophecy here, if you're watching this class in the future, online, on YouTube or on BibleTalk.tv, there is a link that you will see on your screen, and simply click that link and it'll bring you to view the video that we are going to view here live this morning.